my sleepy friends, and welcome back to Boring Sleepy History. So glad you've joined me for another gentle journey through time. Let's get all cozy and comfy, find your favorite spot, maybe snuggle under a blanket. Let those shoulders melt right down. Are you settled in, perhaps with a warm drink? Where are you listening from tonight? What time is it in your corner of the world? I hope wherever you are, you're feeling peaceful and ready to drift off into a historical dream. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more sleepy tales, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss out on our next soothing historical adventure. Now, close your eyes for a moment. Imagine the salty tang of the Atlantic air, thick with the scent of hemp and tar. The sun, a hazy orange orb just peeking over the horizon, paints the cobblestone streets of a bustling Portuguese port in gold. The air vibrates with the cries of gulls and the creak of mighty wooden ships, their sails billowing like the breaths of sleeping giants. You're a sailmaker, your calloused hands working diligently on a tattered canvas, the rhythmic needlework a lullaby against the cacophony of the port. The weight of untold adventures hangs heavy in the air as ships prepare to embark on voyages to lands beyond imagination. And that's where our story begins. Wool blanket felt familiar against my cheek, a comforting weight against the cool morning air. A faint light, the pale ghost of dawn, seeped through the cracks in the shutters. I stretched, the familiar ache in my back a testament to yesterday's work. The sounds of the port were already stirring, a low hum rising to a vibrant chorus. The cry of gulls, sharp and insistent, pierced the quiet of my small room. Below, the rhythmic thud of a hammer echoed, punctuated by the creak of ropes and the shouts of dockworkers. I slipped out of bed, the floorboards cool beneath my bare feet. The salt air, thick and heavy with the promise of a busy day, filled my lungs. It tasted familiar, a tangy, slightly bitter bite that was as much a part of me as the calluses on my hands. I ran my fingers over the rough-spun canvas of my work apron, the texture a comforting familiarity. The day was stretching before me, a canvas itself, awaiting the intricate dance of needle and thread. My workshop, a small space tucked away from the main bustle of the port, smelled of tar, fish, and the faint sweetness of hemp. The air was thick with the scent of the sea, mingled with the earthy aroma of the old wooden floorboards, a scent I'd known my entire life. The tools lay neatly arranged on the workbench. Needles of varying sizes, thimbles worn smooth with years of use, balls of sturdy twine, and rolls of canvas, each a different shade of sun-bleached beige and faded brown, whispering tales of past voyages. I began my ritual, a silent prayer woven into the fabric of each stitch. First, I selected a heavy sail, its canvas thick and strong, showing a small tear near the edge. The fabric, though weathered, held the strength of countless journeys. I imagined the hands that had guided this sail across the churning waters, the salty spray that had kissed its surface. This was more than just mending cloth. It was mending a fragment of a story, a piece of someone's journey. I chose a sturdy needle and threaded it with a thick, strong thread, the color a deep ocean blue. The needle felt cool against my fingers, an extension of my own will. With a deep breath, I began my work, the rhythmic in and out of the needle, a steady counterpoint to the rising clamor of the port. Each stitch was a small act of faith, a tiny prayer for safe passage across the unknown. The rhythm was soothing, almost hypnotic. The canvas was a map, each thread a tiny pathway toward a distant shore. I was adding my own thread, my own prayer to their journey. The sun climbed higher, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. The sounds of the port intensified, a symphony of human effort and seafaring dreams. The rhythmic thud of hammers, the cries of the gulls, the creak of ropes all worked together, a chorus accompanying the steady beat of my needle. Each stitch was a tiny victory, a whisper of hope and safety against the endless expanse of the sea. My work would play its part in carrying dreams of faraway lands, and it filled me with a quiet pride. The rough-hewn wooden table felt cool beneath my fingertips as I sat, the pre-dawn light barely painting the edges of the bustling port in shades of gray and rose. The air hung heavy with the familiar scent of salt, mingled with the sharper tang of fish and the ever-present aroma of tar, a smell that clung to everything, a smell that was home. My small workshop, tucked away in a quiet corner of the docks, felt strangely peaceful despite the growing clamor outside. My hands, calloused and strong from years of working with heavy canvas and coarse twine, moved with a practiced grace. First, the needle, its blunt end worn smooth from countless stitches, was carefully selected from its worn leather case. I ran my thumb over its surface, feeling the familiar weight, the subtle balance in its hand. Then the thread, a thick, sturdy flax, chosen for its strength and resilience, was carefully measured and threaded through the eye. The ritual was as familiar as breathing, each movement a silent prayer for the journeys these stitches would undertake. The canvas itself, a mountainous pile of coarse, thick fabric, felt comforting in its weight. It was the color of sand bleached by the sun, patched and mended in countless places, bearing witness to storms weathered and waves conquered. I selected a particularly large section, already marked with a chalk outline indicating the tear I would mend. The rip, a jagged gash roughly the length of my forearm, suggested a hard-fought battle against the elements. I examined it closely, assessing the damage, my eyes seeking out any areas of weakness within the broader fabric. It would need more than just a hasty repair. It required strength, resilience, qualities I aimed to imbue into every stitch. With a steady breath, I began. The needle pierced the heavy canvas, the rhythmic in and out of the stitch a silent mantra that calmed my mind and focused my energy. Each puncture was precise, each pull of the thread measured and deliberate. The coarse fibers yielded slightly, the needle sinking in and out with a soft, satisfying whisper. My focus was absolute, my mind quiet, lost in the simple yet complex act of creation. The rhythmic motion became almost hypnotic, a soothing counterpoint to the growing sounds of the port outside my door. As I worked, my thoughts drifted to those who would rely on this mended sail, those men who would soon brave the vast ocean, their lives entrusted in some small measure to my skill and diligence. I thought of their hopes, their dreams, the fear mixed with excitement that must certainly linger. I hoped to give them the reassurance of strength, the confidence in my stitches, so they could trust that I did my best to ensure they return. The very thought felt somehow sacred, the weight of responsibility a silent pressure under my fingertips. One stitch after another, the tear began to disappear, the ragged edges gently pulled together, until finally the repair was complete. I ran my hand over the mended section, feeling the smoothness, the uniformity of the fabric, my touch a silent confirmation of the sail's renewed strength. I looked at the entire sail, a seemingly insignificant patch in a large canvas, yet also a testament to a life sustained by the skills and crafts of many hands. The single, now imperceptible, mended tear felt like a symbol, a representation of many voyages, countless sailors, and the silent prayers held within each stitch. The sun, a now risen orb of fiery gold, cast a long shadow across my workshop, hinting that the day and the many tasks it held had truly begun. The air hung thick with the smells of salt, fish, and tar, a familiar perfume that clung to the very fabric of my being. The morning sun, still low in the sky, cast long shadows across the cobbled docks, highlighting the frantic energy of the port. Hammers rang out a rhythmic clang, punctuated by the raucous cries of gulls overhead. A symphony of chaos, yet somehow ordered, familiar. It was the dawn chorus of the sea, and I, a humble sailmaker, was a part of its grand orchestration. My fingers, calloused and strong from years of working with heavy canvas, moved with a practiced ease. The needle, a familiar weight in my hand, pierced the thick fabric, each stitch a small act of creation, a silent prayer for safe passage. I was mending a tear, a small imperfection in a vast expanse of sailcloth, a detail that felt insignificant, yet somehow crucial. One tear mended, many journeys insured. But my hands weren't the only ones at work. Around me, the dock bustled with activity. A cacophony of voices rose above the rhythmic thud of hammers and the creak of ropes. I caught snippets of conversations, overheard fragments of sailors' plans, their hopes and fears hanging heavy in the salty air. One group, clustered around a barrel, spoke of spices, of faraway lands bathed in the golden light of a different sun. Their words painted vivid images in my mind, lands I would only ever know through the stories they brought back, the patched sails I mended for their return. Another group, their faces etched with a mixture of excitement and trepidation, spoke of the long voyage ahead. Their words were hushed, laced with an unspoken anxiety that echoed my own silent concerns. They spoke of storms, of unpredictable winds, of the vastness of the ocean, its power to both cradle and destroy. I saw the reflection of their apprehension in their eyes, a shared fear subtly woven into the fabric of their everyday conversation. There was a vulnerability there, a human fragility beneath the bravado of seafaring men. Yet, amidst the anxieties, a potent undercurrent of excitement pulsed through their words. Whispers of adventure, of untold riches, of discovering new horizons, danced on the salty breeze. Their dreams, born of youthful optimism and the intoxicating allure of the unknown, mingled with the older, wiser apprehension of the sea. The weight of responsibility sat heavily on their shoulders, a shared burden that bound them together. And in that shared experience, I found my own connection. My work, seemingly mundane, was the bridge connecting these dreams, these hopes, and these fears. Each carefully sewn stitch was a small but essential element in their grand adventure, a silent testament to their belief in my skill, and perhaps a testament to their own courageous spirit. In their anticipation, in their fear, in their excitement, I found a quiet, deep connection to their journey, a shared sense of purpose that transcended the physical distance between us. I was more than a sailmaker. I was a silent guardian, a part of their odyssey, a quiet witness to their hopes and dreams. The weight of their journey, their trust in me and my work, settled on my shoulders like the weight of the sails themselves. The sun climbed higher, painting the sky in hues of pale orange and soft rose. The air, thick with the smell of brine and tar, carried the distant cries of gulls. My hands, calloused and strong from years of working the canvas, moved with a practiced rhythm, needle flashing in and out of the coarse fabric. I was lost in the quiet repetition, the steady stitch, 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 a kind of meditation born of years spent coaxing life back into worn sails. It was a simple task, yet in each mended tear I felt the weight of the ocean, the hope of distant shores, the lives entrusted to the strength of my work. A shadow fell across my workbench. I looked up, momentarily startled, and met the gaze of the captain. He stood tall and broad-shouldered, his weathered face etched with the map of countless voyages. The sea wind whipped a stray strand of gray hair across his forehead. He didn't speak, didn't need to. His presence alone spoke volumes. It was a presence that filled the small space between us, heavy with the unspoken anxieties and the quiet confidence of a man who knew the sea intimately, a man whose life depended on the integrity of the sails that would carry him and his crew across the relentless expanse of water. He gestured towards the sail I was working on, a small, almost imperceptible movement of his hand. I followed his gaze, my own hand lingering on the newly mended seam. The tear, once a gaping wound, was now barely visible, swallowed by the robust fabric. It was a small detail, an almost insignificant repair, yet it held within it the entire weight of our shared venture. The captain's silent acknowledgment of my work was more profound than any praise, more comforting than any assurance. It was a silent pact sealed between us, a shared understanding of the responsibility we each carried, the trust that bound us together, the quiet hope that fueled our joint pursuit. His eyes, the color of a stormy sea, met mine. They were not cold, not distant, but rather contained a depth of experience and a quiet intensity that mirrored the endless expanse of the ocean itself. For a brief moment, our eyes locked, a silent conversation passing between us, a shared understanding that needed no words. There was a bond forged not in boisterous camaraderie or loud pronouncements, but in the shared understanding of our roles, the weight of our purpose, and the shared destiny that lay ahead. His eyes, the color of a stormy sea, met mine. They were not cold, not distant, but rather contained a depth of experience and a quiet intensity that mirrored the endless expanse of the ocean itself. For a brief moment, our eyes locked, a silent conversation passing between us, a shared understanding that needed no words. There was a bond forged not in boisterous camaraderie or loud pronouncements, but in the shared understanding of our roles, the weight of our purpose, and the shared destiny that lay ahead. It was a connection born of the sea, forged in the salty air, and strengthened by the silent language of skill and trust. The captain shifted, a subtle movement that broke the unspoken spell. He nodded, a brief, almost imperceptible inclination of the head, a gesture acknowledging the shared burden and the mutual reliance. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, his figure disappearing into the bustling crowd of the docks. The weight of his presence lingered, however, a silent but palpable affirmation of the crucial role I played in the upcoming voyage. The rhythmic beat of my needle slowed, then picked up again, the familiar motion a calming counterpoint to the thrilling anticipation that now pulsed within me. I knew, with a certainty that went beyond mere confidence, that my work mattered, that my stitches held the hopes and dreams of many, and that I played an essential part in this upcoming journey. The needle paused halfway through a particularly stubborn seam. My fingers, calloused and stained with tar, stilled. The rhythmic stitch, the constant companion of my mornings, faltered and died. The canvas, usually a comforting weight in my hands, felt suddenly light, almost insignificant. I looked up, away from the intricate dance of needle and thread, and out across the harbor. The sun, a molten coin emerging from the sea's embrace, cast long shadows across the bustling docks. It painted the water in streaks of gold and rose, a breathtaking spectacle that usually went unnoticed in the flurry of my work. But today, the beauty of the dawn was undeniable, a stark contrast to the churning anxieties within me. Gulls, their cries a familiar soundtrack to my life, wheeled and soared above the ships. They were so free, so effortlessly graceful. They embodied the very spirit of the sea, the untamed energy that drew men and their vessels out into the vast unknown. I watched them, envious of their apparent lack of worry, their effortless navigation of the wind. Yet I knew their lives were a constant struggle, a desperate search for survival, just like ours. My breath hitched. A shiver, not from the morning chill, but from a deeper, more profound unease, ran down my spine. This voyage, more than any before, felt different. Perhaps it was the sheer size of the fleet, the number of souls entrusted to the sea's mercy, the weight of their hopes and dreams resting on the sturdy shoulders of these wooden behemoths and the sails I helped to craft. Each stitch I made was a silent prayer, a whispered hope for a safe return. It wasn't just canvas and thread I was working with, it was the fabric of lives, the very future of families I had never met. This was more than just a job, it was a profound responsibility, a burden I carried with every breath. The salty air, usually a comfort, felt heavy today, laden with unspoken fears and the weight of anticipation. I could almost taste the salt on my tongue, not the familiar tang of the sea, but a metallic taste of apprehension, of the unknown. The smell of tar and fish, normally so grounding, seemed to hold a hint of impending storm, a foreboding that unsettled my usually calm soul. My gaze drifted back to the ships, magnificent in the rising sunlight. They were not just vessels of wood and canvas, they were vessels of hope, dreams, and human lives. Each one carried a story, countless stories, stories that would be written on the sea, etched into the heart of the ocean itself. I was but a small part of this, a quiet observer, a craftsman whose work, though unseen by many, was essential to their journey. My role was unique. I wouldn't share the dangers of the high seas, the thrill of discovery, or the comradeship of shared adventure. My adventure was different, quieter, more solitary. My journey was contained within these four walls, in the rhythm of my stitching. Yet it was a journey nonetheless, a journey into the hearts of those who would venture forth, a silent partnership forged in the quiet hum of work. The sun climbed higher, warming my face, chasing away some of the shadows, both physical and emotional. The fear remained, a constant hum beneath the surface of my thoughts, but it was tempered by a quiet excitement, a sense of purpose that transcended my own anxieties. It was a part of this grand cycle, this constant ebb and flow of departure and return, a constant reminder of life's relentless rhythm and the quiet strength found in unwavering dedication to one's craft. I picked up my needle again, the rhythm of my work resuming, a steady pulse against the rising tide of uncertainty. The sun was climbing, and the ships were waiting. My work, however small, was essential to their journey. The air crackled with a nervous energy, a tangible hum that vibrated through the very timbers of the docks. It was different from the usual morning bustle. This was a frenzied dance of activity, a final, frantic flurry before the plunge into the unknown. The rhythmic clang of hammers, usually a comforting background noise, now felt sharper, more urgent. Each strike seemed to echo the rising tempo of departure. I tightened my grip on my needle, the familiar weight a small comfort amidst the chaos. The canvas under my fingers, usually a source of quiet focus, felt strangely stiff, almost resistant to the familiar rhythm of my stitches. The smell of salt and tar was heavier now, thick and almost suffocating, mingling with the sweat of the men working around me. Everywhere I looked, there was motion, a whirlwind of activity. Sailors, their faces grim with a mixture of determination and apprehension, swarmed over the ships like busy ants. Ropes, thick as my arm, were being hauled and tightened, the wood groaning under the strain. Barrels, crates, and sacks, overflowing with supplies for a journey that could last months, were heaved aboard with grunts and shouts. The air thrummed with the rhythmic creak of blocks and tackles, the cries of men coordinating their efforts, a symphony of controlled chaos. I watched a young sailor, barely a man, meticulously securing a sail. His movements were precise, almost ritualistic, yet there was a tremor in his hands, a visible anxiety betraying his practiced calm. He paused, wiping a bead of sweat from his brow, and looked out at the vast expanse of water, a flicker of uncertainty in his usually bright eyes. I understood that uncertainty. It was a feeling I knew well, a companion to my own quiet anxiety. It was the sea that stirred these emotions, a force that inspired both awe and fear. My work took on a new significance in this heightened atmosphere. Each stitch I made felt heavy with responsibility. Each completed seam a small victory against the vastness of the ocean. The minor repairs I'd been undertaking earlier had expanded into a far more complex and urgent task. The main sails of several vessels needed bolstering and reinforcing, and my experienced hands were in high demand. My fellow sailmakers and I worked shoulder to shoulder, a silent camaraderie binding us together amidst the rush. We were the last line of defense before these brave souls set sail. The farewells were the most poignant part. Short, often wordless embraces between sailors and their loved ones, punctuated by quiet sobs, hushed whispers, and the occasional tearful wave. Mothers clutched children, their faces etched with worry. Fathers offered stoic nods, and sisters exchanged quick, fleeting glances that spoke volumes of unspoken hope and fear. It was a collective moment of profound human emotion, a shared vulnerability in the face of the ocean's unknowable power. I found myself strangely removed, yet deeply affected by the shared emotion washing over the dock. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the bustling scene, the final preparations were completed. The ships, once seemingly inert giants, were now ready, poised to leave. A palpable sense of urgency filled the air, a collective breath held just before the plunge. My own hands, weary but purposeful, finished the last repair, and with a final satisfying stitch, I looked out at the sea, ready to witness their journey into the vast and unpredictable expanse, a journey I would share in my own quiet way from the stability of the shore. The air grew heavy, not just with the usual salty tang, but with a strange stillness. The clamor of the port, which had been a constant hum for days, was fading, replaced by a quieter kind of energy, a hush almost, as if everyone held their breath. I leaned against my workbench, the rough wood familiar and comforting under my hands. My needle lay still, the thread dangling loose, a forgotten end to a long day's work. My gaze drifted to the water. The first ship, a magnificent thing, a three-master with sails billowing full, started to move. It was almost imperceptible at first, a subtle shift in its position against the backdrop of the harbor. Then, slowly, deliberately, it began to pull away from the docks, its hull parting the water with a gentle sigh. The sounds of the ropes creaking, of the wind catching the sails, were like a whispered goodbye. More ships followed, each a mirror of the first, each a vessel carrying its own silent stories. I watched, mesmerized, as they formed a line, a slowly departing procession, moving towards the horizon. The individual bustle faded, merging into a single graceful departure. Each ship was a tiny island of humanity, drifting further and further from land. There was a profound stillness in this movement, a quiet majesty. The sun, low in the sky, cast long shadows, painting the water in shades of gold and deep amber. The gulls, usually boisterous and demanding, seemed hushed, their cries muted, their movements less frantic. The whole scene felt like a sacred ritual, a poignant farewell. The sadness that washed over me wasn't a sharp pain, more like a gentle ache, a deep, resonant hum beneath the surface of my thoughts. It was the sadness of letting go, of releasing something precious into the unknown. Each ship held within it the hopes and dreams of its crew, the weight of their ambitions, the fragile courage of their undertaking. They were carrying pieces of the world with them, pieces of our community, and pieces of my own heart, woven into the sails I had mended. This quiet sadness was balanced with a deep and profound awe. These magnificent vessels, their sails catching the light, were testaments to human ingenuity and courage, tiny specks against the vastness of the ocean. I felt a strange connection to those sailors, a silent kinship. Not a personal bond, for I knew them only as shadows and voices, but a shared understanding of risk, of longing, of the inherent bravery required to step into the unpredictable embrace of the sea. Each stitch I'd made, each piece of canvas I'd repaired, felt heavier now, imbued with a new weight of responsibility. They weren't just threads, but the very fabric of their hopes, holding them together as they ventured into the limitless horizon. This quiet sadness was balanced with a deep and profound awe. These magnificent vessels, their sails catching the light, were testaments to human ingenuity and courage, tiny specks against the vastness of the ocean. I felt a strange connection to those sailors, a silent kinship. Not a personal bond, for I knew them only as shadows and voices, but a shared understanding of risk, of longing, of the inherent bravery required to step into the unpredictable embrace of the sea. Each stitch I'd made, each piece of canvas I'd repaired, felt heavier now, imbued with a new weight of responsibility. They weren't just threads, but the very fabric of their hopes, holding them together as they ventured into the limitless horizon. As the last ship disappeared beyond the headlands, swallowed by the growing expanse of the ocean, a cold wind picked up, stirring the dust on the docks. The silence became more profound. A sense of peace settled over me, not a peaceful quiet, but a peaceful resignation, a sense of something completed, a part of the cycle concluded. My work, for now, was done, but the sea, ever restless, ever calling, would soon demand my skills again. The air, thick with the scent of salt and tar just moments ago, now hung heavy and still. The rhythmic clang of hammers, the shouts of dockworkers, the cries of gulls, all vanished, leaving behind an unnerving silence. It was as if the very heart of the port had been scooped out, leaving a hollow ache where vibrant life had thrummed only hours before. The sun, climbing higher in the sky, cast long skeletal shadows from the empty cranes, accentuating the sudden emptiness. I leaned against my workbench, the familiar weight of my tools a small comfort in the overwhelming stillness. The canvas, usually strewn across my table, lay neatly folded, the unfinished edges of a new sail waiting patiently. My hands, usually busy with needle and thread, felt strangely idle, clumsy, and unused. The rhythmic stitch, my constant companion, was absent, leaving a void mirrored by the emptiness in the harbor. My gaze drifted towards the water, the surface now a mirror reflecting the clear blue sky, undisturbed by the wake of departing ships. The masts, once a forest of tall, proud silhouettes, were gone, swallowed by the horizon. It was a strange feeling, this quiet. Not the peaceful quiet of a still night, but a silence pregnant with absence, a void echoing with the echoes of departed voices, the fading sounds of farewells. I thought of the young sailor, his bright eyes full of naive hope, and wondered what the vast ocean held for him. His simple story, a tale woven with threads of adventure and fear, played in my mind like a half-forgotten tune. His hope, so easily shared, felt fragile now, adrift in the immensity of the sea. My own experience had taught me to temper such enthusiasm with a more cautious optimism, a knowledge born of countless departures and returns. The old woman's words drifted to my thoughts. She had spoken of cycles, of the ebb and flow of the tides, the rhythmic departure and return of the ships, the constant cycle of life and death playing out against the backdrop of the unchanging sea. Her wisdom, a quiet reassurance, offered a different perspective, a calmer view of the uncertainties. She had seen more sunsets than I had seen dawns, had weathered storms both literal and figurative, and yet she continued to find solace in the predictable rhythms of the sea. The emptiness, I realized, wasn't a negative space, but rather a pause, a silent breath before the next wave of activity crashed over the docks. The silence was a prelude, a necessary interval between the departure and the eventual return. It was in this stillness that the weight of my work settled upon me. each stitch a thread in the vast tapestry of human journeys, each sail a vessel carrying dreams and fears across the relentless expanse of the ocean. And so I sat, the quiet solitude settling around me like a warm blanket. The sun continued its slow journey across the sky, casting a golden hue over the still waters. The scent of the sea, still present, now held a different quality. Not the vibrant energy of the bustling port, but a gentler, more enduring essence, a promise of the return of the ships and the return of the voices, and life to the docks. It was a peace born of knowing that this silence, however profound, was temporary, a necessary prelude to the next chapter. The days that followed the departure settled over the port like a thick fog, muffling the usual boisterous sounds. The air, once thick with the smells of tar and fish, now held a quieter, almost melancholic scent, a blend of salt and damp wood. My own hands, usually rough and calloused from hours spent wrestling with heavy canvas, felt strangely idle. The rhythmic stitching, the steady push and pull of the needle was absent, leaving a void not just in my work, but in the very rhythm of my days. The familiar creak of the dock, the shouts of the dockworkers, all seemed muted, as if the departure of the fleet had taken a piece of the port's very soul. I found myself drawn to the edge of the water, staring out at the empty expanse where the ships had once been. The horizon, once a line of hopeful sails, was now just a hazy blue meeting an equally hazy sky. The gulls still circled, their cries echoing in the stillness, but even their calls sounded different, a mournful counterpoint to the silence. The rhythmic crash of the waves against the pilings was the only constant, a relentless reminder of the ocean's vastness, the distance that separated me from the sailors I had helped to send away. My small workshop, usually filled with the comforting chaos of my work, felt strangely empty. The scent of beeswax and hemp, usually a source of quiet comfort, now felt heavy, a reminder of the work left undone, the voyages still underway. The half-finished sails lay waiting, their unfinished edges mocking my idleness. Even the familiar weight of the needle and thread felt foreign in my hand. My mind, usually focused on the meticulous detail of my craft, drifted to the faces of my loved ones left behind. Then, one mid-morning, a familiar hand appeared at my workshop door. It was the postman, his weathered face etched with the lines of countless journeys. In his hand he held a simple letter, bearing the familiar wax seal of my family home. My heart, quiet for so long, thumped a sudden hopeful rhythm against my ribs. I knew, instinctively, the letter carried with it a piece of the life I had temporarily left behind. With trembling fingers, I broke the seal. The paper, thin and slightly brittle, held the familiar scent of ink and parchment. My eyes scanned the neatly penned words, each one a familiar touchstone in my memory, each word painting a vivid picture of the life that continued without me. Descriptions of ordinary days, the laughter of my children, the gentle wisdom in the eyes of my wife, the comforting smell of bread baking in the oven. Details flowed from the page, filling the emptiness that had been gnawing at my soul since the departure of the fleet. The letter ended with a simple, heartfelt message. Words of love, words of trust, and words of quiet hope for my safe return. It was a small thing, a single sheet of paper filled with ordinary words, yet its impact was profound. The silence in my workshop did not vanish, nor did the vastness of the ocean that separated me from my sailors, but the emptiness had been filled with a different kind of presence. The comfort of my home, the warmth of my family, held as a tangible truth against the uncertain reality of the sea. In the quiet of my workshop, I found myself no longer so alone. The letter served as a bridge, a lifeline across the gulf of distance, connecting me to the simple, steady beat of my life ashore, and reminding me of the purpose that lie in the quiet stitch, even as the grand voyage unfolded upon the endless waves. The days that followed the fleet's departure unfolded in a slow, measured rhythm, much like the stitching of a sail. But the quiet hum of my usual work was now overlaid with a constant, low thrum of anticipation. It wasn't a loud, insistent noise, more like the distant rumble of a storm gathering on the horizon. News of the fleet trickled in, fragmented and unreliable, carried on the wind like the scent of brine and salt. One morning, it was a brief exchange overheard between two dockworkers, their words clipped and hurried. "Heard they've met with contrary winds," one said, his voice tight with concern. The other grunted in agreement, his eyes darting towards the distant, gray expanse of sea. I felt a tightening in my chest, a familiar ache that mirrored the strain of pulling taut a sail against a stiff breeze. It wasn't my sail, not my journey, yet the connection was undeniable. The next day, it was an old fisherman, his face etched with the map of 1,000 storms, who offered a cryptic update. "Slow going, they say," he mumbled, his voice raspy with age and sea spray. "The currents are playing tricks, they say, testing the patience of even the strongest captains." His words hung in the air, heavy and weighted with unspoken concerns, painting vivid pictures of creaking masts and straining rigging. I saw myself, not in my workshop, but swaying on the deck of one of those ships, feeling the pull of the waves against the hull. The snippets of information weren't alarming, not yet. They were more like the subtle shifts in the weather, the gradual darkening of the sky before a storm. Each piece of news, each hushed whisper, added another layer of tension, another thread to the tapestry of uncertainty I was now weaving in my mind. It was a vicarious journey, this slow unfolding of news, a silent participation in the adventures and anxieties of those distant sailors. My hands, normally steady and precise, occasionally faltered. The needle would skip a stitch, a tiny imperfection in the otherwise perfect pattern. My mind, usually focused on the task at hand, drifted towards the open ocean, conjuring images of tall ships battling unpredictable winds, of sailors battling fatigue and the endless expanse of water. Their faces, though nameless, became familiar to me, the hope etched on their skin, the uncertainty in their eyes. These men, whose journeys I had unknowingly shaped with my work, were no longer distant figures. They had become extensions of myself, their trials and tribulations reflecting and amplifying my own. Even the familiar routines of my day took on a different hue. The rhythmic thud of my hammer against the wood became a heartbeat, mimicking the steady rhythm of the waves. The smell of tar and canvas now carried the faintest whisper of sea salt and distant storms. The gulls that circled the harbor seemed to be carrying messages, their cries echoing the anxious whispers of the townsfolk. My world, once confined to the four walls of my workshop, had expanded to encompass the boundless ocean, the lives of the sailors intertwined with my own. The line between my quiet life and their unpredictable journey had blurred, becoming almost indistinguishable. The work continued, but it wasn't merely mending sails anymore. It was mending hopes and anxieties. And in that mending, I found a strange sort of peace, a quiet understanding of the boundless uncertainties of life on sea and land. The salty air held a different tang today, less the sharp bite of the sea and more the whisper of distant events. The usual clamor of the docks was muted, a low hum beneath the surface of my work. My hands, calloused and familiar with the coarse canvas, moved with a rhythm born of years spent mending sails, stitching together the hopes and dreams of countless voyages. Yet today, the rhythm felt different, punctuated by the snatches of conversation that drifted past my workbench. A group of dockworkers, their faces etched with the lines of sun and sea, huddled near the barrels of salted fish. I heard a word here, a phrase there, fragments of news about the fleet. "Rough seas, south of," one muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Another chimed in, "Sighted a storm," his words trailing off into the general din of the port. These scraps of information, like pieces of a shattered mirror, reflected a fragmented image of the fleet's journey. They were pieces of a puzzle, hinting at a larger picture, a narrative woven from the threads of rumor and speculation. It was a picture painted in shades of gray, not the stark blacks and whites of certainty, but the subtle hues of possibility and worry. Later, in the midday sun, I overheard a pair of old sailors leaning against the hull of a ship, their weathered faces creased with the wisdom of countless voyages. They spoke in low tones, their words like pebbles tossed into a still pond, creating ripples of information. "The Morning Star lost a mast," one rasped, his voice thick with the weight of years. The other grunted in response, but reached islands safely. Each snippet of news added a new layer to the ever-shifting picture I was constructing in my mind. The Morning Star. I had sewn a sail for her just last week, remembering the young captain's earnest gaze, the weight of his responsibility palpable in the air. Now he was battling storms, clinging to the islands I'd only heard tales of. The afternoon brought a different kind of news, lighter this time, almost buoyant. A woman, her face beaming, recounted a story shared by a returning fishing boat. They saw the fleet from afar, far out to sea, all sails full, heading towards. Her voice trailed off, lost in the joyous speculation of a successful voyage. Even this fragment, however, couldn't completely erase the lingering concern. Her words were optimistic, yet they also reminded me of the sheer vastness of the ocean, the unpredictable nature of its moods, and the immense challenges faced by the fleet. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, I felt a profound sense of connection to those far out at sea. The fleet was no longer just a collection of ships. It was a tapestry woven with the threads of human endeavor, courage, and risk. I had played a small but vital part in their journey. Each stitch I'd made a silent prayer for their safe return. And now, through the whispers and rumors that filled the port, I felt as though I was sailing with them, experiencing their joys and fears through the fragmented lens of news and gossip. The ocean was vast, the journey unpredictable, but the thread of shared experience bound us together, a silent kinship forged across the miles of water and the vast distance of sea and land. The midday sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones as I paused my work, the familiar ache in my back a welcome reminder of the steady rhythm of my days. The air, still thick with the scent of salt and drying canvas, carried a different note now, a quieter hum than the frantic energy of the departure. It was then I saw her, seated on a weathered crate near the docks, a figure as ancient and stoic as the sea itself. Her face, a road map of wrinkles etched by sun and wind, held a quiet strength, a knowing glint in her eyes that spoke of countless sunrises and sunsets witnessed from these very stones. She was mending a small, intricate net, her nimble fingers moving with a practiced ease that mirrored my own. A faded shawl draped over her shoulders, the color of sea foam after a storm, whispered stories of winters endured and seas braved. I hesitated, then approached, drawn by the quiet aura of experience that surrounded her. "Good day," I ventured, my voice barely above a whisper, respectful of the silent contemplation that seemed to envelop her. She looked up, her gaze piercing yet gentle, as if seeing straight through the layers of my own anxieties. A small smile played on her lips, a fleeting flicker of recognition. "And to you, Sailmaker," she replied, her voice raspy, like the creak of an old ship's hull. "The sea's breath still fills your hands." I nodded, acknowledging the truth in her words, the lingering scent of salt clinging to my skin, the phantom ache of stitches in my fingers. We fell into a comfortable silence, the rhythmic click of her needle a counterpoint to the gentle lapping of waves against the nearby dock. Finally, she spoke, her words like pebbles smoothed by the tide. "They've gone far, haven't they, your ships?" I confirmed, my throat tightening slightly. "Yes, many leagues across the waves." She chuckled, a dry, rustling sound. "I've seen many fleets depart, Sailmaker. Many more return, and some don't." She paused, her gaze distant, lost in the memory of voyages past. Her words, though tinged with melancholy, held no fear. Instead, they carried a seasoned wisdom, a calm acceptance of the sea's unpredictable nature. She began to share snippets of other departures, each a microcosm of the grand voyages undertaken. Young lads filled with untamed dreams, seasoned captains burdened by responsibility, and the quiet hopes of those left behind. Each story was punctuated by the rhythmic click of her needle, each stitch a silent punctuation mark in the tapestry of her life's experiences. She spoke of storms that swallowed ships whole, of miraculous escapes against insurmountable odds, and of the quiet strength that carried sailors through the darkest nights. These tales were not tales of heroism or grand adventures, but of perseverance, of facing hardship with a quiet dignity. They weren't designed to thrill or excite, but to prepare. She painted a picture of the sea not as a villain, but a powerful force, both unforgiving and nurturing, a testament to the balance of the world. Her words were a balm to my own anxieties, tempering the naive optimism of the young sailor I'd spoken with earlier, and grounding my own anxieties in a broader understanding of the life cycle of seafaring, of departure, and of uncertain yet inevitable return. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the harbor, her stories offered a comforting perspective, a quiet acceptance of the unknown that settled like a warm blanket on my soul. The ocean's vastness was still daunting, but I felt a renewed sense of calm, a reassurance that came not from blind hope, but from the accumulated wisdom of a life spent watching the seas ebb and flow. The air hung heavy, thick with the scent of brine and a strange metallic tang that spoke of impending rain. The usual gentle rhythm of the port, the familiar creak of masts, and the distant calls of gulls was swallowed by a rising, ominous wind. It began subtly, a low moan that whispered through the narrow alleys, a tremor that ran through the wooden buildings, but it quickly gathered strength, swelling into a furious roar that seemed to tear at the very fabric of the town. I stopped my work, the half-finished repair forgotten in my lap. The canvas, usually a comforting weight in my hands, felt strangely flimsy against the growing violence of the storm. The rhythmic click of my needle, my usual solace, was drowned out by the howling wind, a symphony of destruction that filled the air. Rain began to lash against the windows of my small workshop, a relentless drumming that mirrored the frantic beating of my own heart. Each gust of wind seemed to press against my chest, a physical manifestation of the anxiety that coiled within me. I thought of the fleet, of those brave men sailing towards the unknown, their fragile vessels tossed about like toys in the hands of a giant. My stitches, my careful work, were out there, battling the elements, bearing the weight of their hopes and dreams. The wind shrieked and howled, a terrifying chorus of nature's power. It was a sound I knew, a sound born from the depths of the ocean, a sound that spoke of immense strength and merciless indifference. I pictured the waves, towering mountains of water, crashing against the hulls of the ships, threatening to swallow them whole. I imagined the sailors clinging to their ropes, their faces etched with fear and determination, their bodies strained against the brutal forces of the storm. The old woman's words from earlier that day echoed in my mind, her calm acceptance of the sea's unpredictable nature. She had spoken of the respect owed to the ocean, of its power to both destroy and create. But her words, usually a balm to my anxieties, felt inadequate against the ferocity of this storm. This was not the gentle sway of a summer breeze. This was a violent, untamed force that mocked any human attempt at control. My workshop, usually a haven of quiet industry, became a battleground. The wind rattling the windows, the rain battering against the walls, the very structure seeming to tremble under the strain. I could feel the vibrations through the floorboards, a physical connection to the turmoil raging at sea. I pressed my hand against the cool wood, seeking some grounding, some sense of stability amidst the chaos. Yet even the sturdy wood seemed to vibrate with the storm's power. I pictured the sails, the ones I had mended, the ones I had created, facing the relentless assault of the wind and waves. Would they hold? Would they tear under the strain? Would they bring the sailors safely home? The questions clawed at me, a desperate need for reassurance, battling against the overwhelming uncertainty. The storm raged on, mirroring my inner turmoil, a relentless dance of fear and hope, a terrifying and beautiful spectacle of nature's fury. The night was long, the storm unrelenting. The days bled into weeks. each sunrise painting the same familiar scene. The bustling yet predictable rhythm of the port, the steady cadence of my needle against the canvas. The whispers about the fleet's progress had dwindled to a low hum, a background drone to the quiet routine of my work. Hope, a fragile seedling, had begun to take root, a quiet certainty that the ships would return, their sails full, their crews safe. But the sea, even from the shore, possesses a fickle nature, its moods shifting with the capricious winds. One afternoon, a shadow fell across my usual sun-drenched workbench. It wasn't the shadow of a passing cloud, but of a man, his face etched with lines of worry and fatigue. He was a dockhand, a man I'd seen countless times, his face usually open and jovial. Today, it held a weight that silenced the usual sounds of the port in my ears. He spoke in hushed tones, his words carrying the weight of unspoken news. "The sea serpent," he began, his voice low and strained. She's in trouble." The name of one of the ships, a sturdy vessel, felt like a physical blow. My hands, usually so deft and sure, trembled slightly. The Sea Serpent had been a proud ship, her sails, some of which I had personally mended, billowing like the wings of a majestic bird. The thought of her struggling, of the men aboard her facing hardship, sent a cold shiver down my spine, despite the warmth of the sun on my skin. The dockhand's words dribbled out slowly, each syllable carefully chosen, heavy with the unspoken. He spoke of a storm, a fierce and unforgiving tempest far out at sea, of a distress signal received, faint and fragmented, its meaning unclear. He spoke of uncertainty, of anxious waiting, of the hope slowly fading as hours stretched into days since the last incomplete message. The air grew thick with unspoken fear, a palpable presence settling over the usually vibrant port. The rhythmic stitch of my needle faltered, the steady rhythm breaking into a jerky, uneven beat, mirroring the turmoil in my heart. My usual calm was replaced by a gnawing anxiety, a prickly sense of unease that settled deep in my gut. The salty air, once comforting and familiar, tasted bitter on my tongue. The rough canvas under my fingers felt coarse and unforgiving, a painful reminder of the fragile nature of life at sea. The news spread through the docks like wildfire, carried on the whispers of anxious men and women. Faces that had been illuminated by the promise of return were now etched with concern. The children who used to play near the docks fell silent, their usual laughter replaced by an uneasy stillness. Even the gulls seemed to sense the change in mood, their cries sounding sharper, less carefree. The weight of this unexpected news pressed down heavily. It wasn't just a story of a ship in trouble, it was a story of the men I knew, even if only from a distance. Men whose sails I had mended, whose journeys I had silently accompanied with each stitch. Their fates, once seemingly certain, were now caught in the unpredictable currents of the sea, leaving me stranded on the shore, helpless, yet inextricably linked to their uncertain voyage. My quiet hope was shattered, replaced by a gnawing anxiety, a mixture of fear and impotent rage against the unforgiving power of the ocean. The long wait was no longer merely monotonous, it had become a cruel test of patience, an agonizing vigil against the relentless march of time. The sun, a pale disk in the hazy sky, cast long shadows across the cobblestones as I began my day. The port, once a cacophony of shouts and creaks, hummed with a quieter energy. The departure of the fleet had left a void, a silence that settled into the bones of the place, a stark contrast to the frenetic energy of just weeks before. The initial anxieties, the sharp edges of worry, had softened. They weren't gone entirely. No, not the quiet hum of concern that vibrated just beneath the surface of my daily life, but they had dulled, smoothed by the relentless passage of time. Days bled into weeks, marked only by the subtle shifts in the light, the changing tides, the slow, almost imperceptible alterations in the rhythm of the port. My work continued, a soothing ritual of needle and thread, canvas and tar. Each stitch was a small act of creation, a meditation on the passing days. The familiar scent of salt and canvas was still present. The textures, the sounds, all remained. But something had shifted within me. The urgency, the raw immediacy of the days leading up to the departure had faded. It was replaced by something quieter, a more profound kind of anticipation, tempered by the vast, unknowable nature of the sea. I found myself watching the horizon more frequently now, not with the frantic urgency of the first weeks, but with a gentler, more patient gaze. The gulls still wheeled above the harbor, their cries a familiar soundtrack to my work, but their presence seemed less disruptive, more integrated into the quiet rhythm of my existence. I noticed the small details more acutely now, the way the light caught the weathered wood of the docks, the subtle changes in the color of the sea, the subtle shift in the wind. The conversations in the port had changed, too. The frantic speculation, the breathless sharing of rumors had subsided. People still spoke of the missing ship, the sea serpent, but the tone was less urgent, more resigned. There was a shared understanding, a collective acceptance of the uncertainties inherent in seafaring. It was in the quieter conversations, the shared glances, the brief silences between words, that the unspoken anxieties lingered, a quiet thrum beneath the surface of daily life. Evenings were spent in the same manner as the days. The same familiar tasks were undertaken with a slightly altered perspective. The comforting rhythm of the needle, the familiar sense of my workshop remained comforting as always, but they now offered a solace born not just of routine, but of patience. They were a comforting buffer against the unknown, the void created by the fleet's departure, and the lingering mystery concerning the sea serpent. The gentle lapping of the waves against the dock offered a calming balm to the anxieties that were still subtly present. My dreams, too, reflected this shift. They were less vivid, less dramatic. Instead of frantic scenes of storms and struggling ships, I dreamt of calm seas, of gentle breezes, of the quiet rhythm of my needle piercing the canvas. They were dreams of quiet hope, of patient endurance, of the enduring nature of the human spirit. And in this quiet, patient hope, I found a new kind of peace. Salty air, once thick with the anticipation of departure, now carried a different scent. A hint of brine, yes, but also something else, something familiar. It was subtle, like the first whisper of a distant song, but it was there. I paused my work. The needle held mid-air, my fingers still tracing the coarse weave of the canvas. My eyes, drawn to the horizon, instinctively searched the empty expanse of gray-blue water. For weeks, it had been nothing but endless sky and sea, a vast, indifferent canvas mirroring the emptiness in my own heart. The routine of mending, once a comfort, had become a monotonous rhythm, each stitch a dull echo of the departures. Then a flicker, a subtle shift in the light on the horizon. Not a cloud, not a bird, but something solid. My heart quickened, a small, hesitant drumbeat against my ribs. It was too far to be certain, too indistinct, but the possibility, the sheer hope of it, was enough to send a thrill of nervous energy through me. I squinted, shading my eyes with my hand, trying to pierce the hazy distance. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the flicker solidified. A shape began to emerge from the mist, a dark silhouette against the lighter sky. One ship, then another, like shy ghosts materializing from the sea itself. The faint outlines grew sharper, the masts becoming distinct, the hulls taking shape. They were returning. The fleet, after all those weeks of silent waiting, was coming home. A wave of emotion washed over me, a tumultuous mixture of relief and excitement, apprehension and joy. It was a strange feeling, this anticipation of their return. I had watched them depart, seen the faces of those sailors, felt the weight of their hopes and dreams carried out on the sails I had mended. Now they were coming back, changed undoubtedly, but returning nonetheless. The cycle was complete. It was the very essence of my life here, this rhythm of departure and return, a ceaseless ebb and flow of the sea itself. The sun, low in the sky, cast long shadows across the docks. The port, once so vibrant and noisy, had been subdued during the fleet's absence, a muted backdrop to my quiet routine. Now, however, a low hum began to build, a faint tremor in the air, the quiet anticipation of the community palpable. Other sailmakers, dockworkers, even the old woman who shared her wisdom by the harbor wall, all seemed to sense it, this unspoken understanding of the ship's return. We were all collectively holding our breath, waiting for the sound of anchor chains, the rumble of carts, the joyous cries of reunion. I continued to watch, lost in the spectacle of their homecoming. The ships, once distant shapes, were now close enough to discern individual details: the worn canvas of their sails, the damage inflicted by weeks at sea, the men on deck silhouetted against the crimson glow of the setting sun. Each ship held stories, tales of hardship and adventure, of storms weathered and friendships forged. And I, the sailmaker, had played a part in each of those stories, my stitches a silent witness to the journey. The weight of that knowledge settled upon me, a profound and humbling realization of my place in the grand scheme of things. The sea, my silent partner, had delivered them back to port. My hands had given them the tools for their journeys, and my heart now waited patiently for their return stories. The cycle was complete. The salty air, once carrying only the familiar scent of the harbor, now held a new tang, the sharp, briny smell of the open sea, intensified by the approaching vessels. They were still distant, mere smudges on the horizon earlier that morning, but now they were growing, solidifying into the familiar shapes of the ships I knew so well. The sun, high in the sky, glinted off their sails, catching the light in a way that both thrilled and saddened me. Thrilled because it signaled the return of those who had ventured out, saddened because it marked the end of a period of quiet, anxious waiting. My hands, calloused and stained from years of working with hemp and canvas, moved instinctively to the tools of my trade. Needles, awls, and lengths of stout thread lay ready on my workbench, a silent promise of the repairs that awaited me. I knew, even before they docked, that their sails would bear the scars of their journey. The wind and waves, relentless and unforgiving, leave their mark on everything they touch. But it wasn't just the visual that announced their return. It was the sound. At first, it was a subtle change, a deeper resonance in the usual harbor sounds, a low hum that overlaid the cries of gulls and the distant clang of the blacksmith's hammer. Then, as they drew closer, it swelled into a symphony of the sea. The creaking of wood, the groan of timbers straining under the weight of wind and wave, filled the air. It was a music I knew intimately, a language spoken by the ships themselves, a story whispered in the rhythm of their journey. Mingled with the creaks and groans were other sounds, more human. The shouts of sailors, their voices raucous and excited, carried on the wind. I could hear the rhythmic slap of waves against the hulls, a steady, relentless pulse that spoke of the sea's enduring power. And within these sounds I heard the stories. Stories of storms weathered, of calms enjoyed, of camaraderie forged in the face of danger. Each sound was a brushstroke on the canvas of their experience, a detail woven into the grand tapestry of their voyage. A knot of anticipation tightened in my chest. These were more than just ships. They were homes, carrying the lives and hopes of those I knew. There was the captain, of course, his face weathered and etched with the map of countless journeys. And there were the sailors, their faces obscured by distance now, but soon to be filled with stories that I would listen to and perhaps help them to weave into the very fabric of their lives once they returned. I thought of the young sailor I had spoken to before their departure, his eyes wide with the naive enthusiasm of youth. His dreams had sailed with him across the vast ocean. Now he was coming back. His eyes would hold the wisdom of experience. His tales etching a different map on his heart, yet again changed as seafarers were. A bittersweet wave of nostalgia washed over me. The quiet solitude of the past weeks, punctuated only by the rhythm of my work and the distant calls of seabirds, was about to end. The familiar energy of the bustling port would soon return, intensified by the homecoming. The silence would be replaced by the laughter and stories of reunions, the quiet rhythm of my life about to be swept away by the tide of human connection. The air crackled with a different kind of energy now. Gone was the quiet anticipation of departure, replaced by a joyous, almost chaotic energy. The port, which had felt so empty just weeks ago, was teeming with life. A cacophony of sound assaulted my ears. The shouts of dockworkers, the cries of gulls, suddenly amplified by the returning ships. The creak and groan of timber as the vessels settled into their moorings. The familiar scent of salt and tar was overlaid by a new, almost heady perfume. The scent of wood smoke and damp wool, the smells of distant lands clinging to the sailors as they returned. My hands, usually so steady and precise, trembled slightly as I watched. I saw familiar faces, weathered, tanned, etched with the lines of hardship and experience, yet somehow radiating a strange, almost ethereal glow of triumph. The faces were different, sharper, harder, yet the eyes held a familiar flicker of humanity, a recognition of home. They moved with a slower gait, more deliberate, as if the very rhythm of their bodies had been altered by the vastness of the ocean. One young sailor, his face a mask of sun and sea spray, stumbled off his ship, almost falling onto the dock. His eyes, wide and unfocused for a moment, finally settled on someone in the crowd. A woman, small and frail, rushed to meet him. A silent embrace followed, a wordless exchange between two hearts that had endured the long separation. Tears streamed down her face, a salty mix of relief and joy. He, in turn, seemed unable to speak, his own tears a testament to their reunion. The scene was repeated across the dock. The rhythmic thud of hammers seemed to fade into a background hum, drowned out by the sobs and laughter, the joyful cries and the whispered words of reunion. Everywhere I looked, I witnessed these tender, almost sacred moments of reunion. A captain, his back ramrod straight, even after weeks at sea, was met by his children, small figures clinging to his legs, their faces buried in his rough-spun trousers. Another sailor, tall and stoic, simply nodded to an older man, a silent recognition of their shared history, their shared journey. The unspoken understanding was potent. The years of shared hardship communicated in a glance, a touch, the quiet weight of a shared silence. My own heart swelled with a mixture of emotions: pride for my part in their safe return, sadness for the hardships they'd faced, and a deep, abiding satisfaction at the sight of the safe harbor. I wasn't a sailor, not a part of their great adventure, yet I felt intimately woven into their tapestry of life and death, their triumphs and losses. Each stitch I'd placed in their sails, each careful mend, had somehow contributed to their journey's end, to their return to this familiar embrace of earth and home. One by one, sailors approached me. They didn't need words. Their tired smiles, their grateful nods, their handshakes that spoke of miles traversed and dangers overcome were enough. The weight of their silent gratitude rested on my shoulders, a comforting burden. I had been a silent observer, a quiet cog in the grand machine of their voyages. But today, in the midst of the joyous chaos, I felt truly seen, truly part of something much larger than myself. The sunset, fiery and magnificent, painted the sky as the last of the ships were secured. Even the gulls seemed quieter now, their cries softer, as if acknowledging the day's end and the safe return of their brethren from the vast, unknowable sea. The familiar scent of salt and canvas filled my small workshop again. The rhythmic scrape of my knife against the worn leather, the satisfying thud of the mallet as I drove home a new tack, these were the sounds of my return. The great voyage was over. The ships were back, safe in the harbor, their masts like weary giants leaning against the sky. But my work, the quiet, steady rhythm of it, remained. The sails were damaged, of course, torn in the storms, frayed by the relentless sun and salt spray. Each tear, each frayed edge whispered tales of the ocean's fury, a silent testament to the trials faced by the sailors. I examined the worn fabric, tracing the lines of the damage with my calloused fingers. This sail, I thought, had seen the Southern Cross, felt the bite of the icy winds. This one, perhaps, had been drenched in tropical rain. Each patch I made was a tiny victory against the sea's relentless power, a small mending against the vast, impersonal forces of nature. The sailors themselves were changed. There was a new quiet about them, a depth in their eyes that hadn't been there before. They moved with a certain stillness, a weariness that spoke not of exhaustion, but of something deeper, a weight carried and borne. I saw it in their faces, the sun-baked skin, the lines etched by wind and worry, the quiet pride in their accomplishments. They spoke little of specific events, of great storms or daring escapes, instead sharing small details, seemingly insignificant things, a flight of exotic birds, a peculiar taste of water, the way the stars looked in a foreign sky. These quiet observations told their own stories, narratives etched in the nuances of their speech, in the lingering glances they exchanged, in the unspoken understanding that passed between them. I listened, as I always did. My workshop had always been a place of quiet exchange, a space for the shared silences between the sea and shore. My needles became a bridge between their journeys and my everyday world, the mending of sails a metaphor for mending the spirit, the soul, the community. And the community had shifted. Subtly, perhaps imperceptibly to some, but it had changed. The old rhythms were now overlaid with the faint echo of distant shores, the unfamiliar notes of foreign tongues, and an almost imperceptible shift in the expectations of life, of trade, and even in the rhythm of the tide itself. Each sail I mended was a reminder of the journey's end, but also a preparation for the journey yet to begin. The cycle, I realized, was not just that of the ships and the sea, but of the people themselves, of their growth, of their coming home transformed. The quiet contentment in my work was not born of simple repetition, but rather of the knowledge that my hands touched the very fabric of lives lived boldly, against the unrelentless power of the sea. It was a slow, rhythmic dance of mending and making, of departure and return, a constant reminder that even the most mundane tasks are threads woven into the grand tapestry of life itself. The setting sun cast long shadows across my workshop as another day drew to its close, and I began to feel the familiar longing for the sound of the sea, for the thrill of a voyage soon to start again. The sun, a molten orange orb, dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of fiery red and soft lavender. Long shadows stretched across the cobblestones of the port, swallowing the last vestiges of the day's bustle. The air, still thick with the scent of salt and tar, grew cooler, a gentle breeze whispering secrets through the rigging of the ships now silently moored. The sounds that had filled the day, the shouts of sailors, the clang of metal, the creak of ropes, faded into a hushed murmur, replaced by the rhythmic lull of the waves lapping against the hulls and the distant, melancholic cries of gulls wheeling overhead. I sat on my usual stool, the familiar weight of the canvas bag resting heavily on my lap. My hands, calloused and stained with years of working with sailcloth, felt strangely still. The needle, usually a tireless companion, lay unused beside me. The day's work was done, the last tear mended, the last stitch carefully secured. The ships, once magnificent vessels preparing for a grand adventure, were now just hulks of wood and canvas, resting after their long journey. I watched them from my workshop, a small haven overlooking the harbor. Each mast, once pointed towards the unknown, now stood still against the darkening sky, a silent testament to the journeys undertaken and the stories they held. I thought of the sailors, their faces etched with the stories of wind and waves, of sun-scorched skin and salt-laced hair. Their return had been a joyous cacophony, a whirlwind of embraces and shared tales. I had heard snippets of their adventures, glimpses of faraway lands and treacherous storms. They were different men now, marked by the sea, yet somehow still themselves. The cycle was complete. Departure, the frenetic energy, the anxious farewells, the uncertain wait, all had reached their natural end. The return, the joyous reunions, the shared stories, the quiet exhaustion, all these too had found their place in the rhythm of the port. The waves, continuing their relentless rhythm against the shore, seemed to mirror this eternal cycle of departure and return, a constant reminder of the enduring nature of life itself. There was a profound sense of peace in the quiet of the evening, a satisfaction not just from the work done, but from witnessing the completion of this grand undertaking, this shared journey between the sea and the land. I had played a small but vital part. My stitches, my quiet skill, had helped carry those brave souls across the vast expanse of the ocean and bring them safely home. A single gull cried out, its mournful sound swallowed by the rising tide. It seemed a fitting elegy, a quiet farewell to this voyage and a welcome to the silent promise of the next. As the last vestiges of light faded into the deepening twilight, I felt a quiet anticipation stirring within me. The next journey, the next sails to mend, the next tales to witness, they will come in time. For now there was only the soothing rhythm of the waves, the distant cries of gulls, and the quiet comfort of a day's work well done. The port slept, and with it I slept too. He sounds like a loving, gentle, and affectionate my skin as I stirred, the familiar sounds of the port seeping into my consciousness. A low, guttural groan from the harbor, the protest of a ship settling against its moorings. The raucous cry of gulls circling high above, their calls echoing the restless energy of the morning. The rhythmic thud of hammers, a steady heartbeat against the symphony of the port. I stretched, the familiar aches in my back a testament to yesterday's work, and breathed in deeply. The salty air filled my lungs, a thick, pungent brew of tar, fish, and the ever-present tang of the sea. It was a familiar comfort, a taste I knew as intimately as my own name. My fingers, even before I opened my eyes, began to twitch, anticipating the feel of the coarse canvas, the smooth, cool steel of my needles. The day's work called, a silent summons as old as the sea itself. I knew, even before I sat up, that the scent clinging to the air was not just the usual blend of port smells. A different sharpness, a hint of something fresh. The smell of freshly cut wood, perhaps, or something else entirely. The anticipation built, a gentle hum beneath the surface of my quiet awakening. I pulled on my worn leather boots, the familiar scuff of leather against the wooden floor, a comforting sound. Stepping outside my small dwelling, the full force of the port's energy hit me. The morning light was still soft, a pale wash of gray giving way to the promise of sunrise. But the air throbbed with activity. Men shouted orders, their voices rough and hoarse from years spent battling wind and wave. The rhythmic creak of ropes being hauled, the clanging of metal against metal, the splash of water against the hulls, a symphony of seafaring life. This morning, however, felt different. There was a greater intensity to the bustle, a frenetic energy that went beyond the usual pre-voyage preparations. More people than usual thronged the docks, their faces animated, a mixture of excitement and apprehension evident in their every movement. I saw the familiar faces of dockworkers, their movements quick and purposeful. They moved with a nervous energy I recognized. This wasn't just any day. This was a departure, a significant one. I made my way to my workshop, a small, cluttered space smelling of sailcloth, tar, and the ghosts of countless voyages. The air hummed with the anticipation of the day ahead. Sunlight, finally breaking through the morning mist, illuminated dust motes dancing in the air, each a tiny reflection of the grander movements taking place outside. I stretched, the familiar weight of them grounding me. The needles, honed sharp, gleamed under the pale light. The strong thread, thick and durable, waited patiently for my touch. The canvas, rough and sturdy, lay spread before me, a silent testament to the journeys it would soon undertake. My gaze fell upon a particularly large sail, its canvas stretched taut, a few small tears marring its otherwise pristine surface. These weren't simple rips, the kind mended in a moment. These cuts spoke of a struggle, a fight against the elements, a reminder of the unpredictable nature of the sea. I touched the fabric, the rough texture a familiar comfort beneath my fingertips. I could feel the strength of the fabric, the skill of the weaver woven into the very threads. This wasn't just a repair. It was a restoration, a reaffirmation of faith in the enduring strength of human craft against the power of nature. The task ahead was substantial. I would need all my strength. But the familiar ritual, the steady rhythm of my work, would begin the day in its usual comforting way. The salty tang of the air, the distant cries of the gulls, they were a familiar lullaby, a promise of a day filled with purpose, with the quiet satisfaction of a craft well done. My stitches, I knew, would once again carry others across the vast ocean, across horizons I might only ever dream of. The first hint was the light. Not the gentle pre-dawn blush I was used to, but a sharper, almost aggressive glow, slicing through the gaps in my shutters. It was still dark, but the air thrummed with a different energy, a sharper edge to the usual morning sounds. The gulls, usually a lazy chorus, were squawking with an unusual urgency. The gulls, usually a lazy chorus, were squawking with an unusual urgency. The rhythmic thud of hammers, normally a comforting background hum, was a frantic, almost chaotic beat. This was no ordinary morning. I pushed myself up, the familiar ache in my back a dull companion. The salty air, usually a comforting caress, tasted different today, sharper, harsher, like the bite of a winter wind. Pulling on my worn leather apron, I felt the familiar stiffness of the coarse fabric, a constant reminder of the long hours spent hunched over my work. Today, those hours promised to be longer than most. Downstairs, the usual sleepy rhythm of the port was replaced by a frenetic dance. Carts rattled and bumped, their wheels groaning under heavy loads. Dockworkers shouted instructions, their voices thick with the urgency of impending departure. The air hung heavy with the smells of tar and sweat, mingled with a metallic tang that usually only appeared after a storm. My workshop, normally a haven of quiet routine, was already filled with an unnerving energy. I saw it immediately. Sprawled across the workbench, a vast expanse of torn canvas. A sail from one of the larger ships, larger than any I'd worked on before. Its surface was a map of destruction, gashes and rips that spoke of a violent encounter with the sea. A shudder ran down my spine. The usual methodical calm that guided my hands was absent. This was no simple tear, a quick stitch here and there. This was a monumental task, a desperate plea woven into the very fabric of the sail. I examined the damage more closely. The canvas was thick and heavy, almost brutally strong. But the tears were deep and jagged, some edges frayed and ragged, testament to a fight against the elements. The sheer size of it intimidated me. It felt like trying to mend a storm itself. My old tools felt heavier in my hands today. The needle, usually a comforting extension of my fingers, now felt clumsy, inadequate. The thread, usually supple and obedient, seemed to resist my touch. Each knot a fight against the urgency of the situation. I ran my fingers along the damaged sail, feeling the stiff, rough texture, the subtle weave betraying a hint of desperation. I imagined the sailors, their hopes and dreams tattered like this very sail, their journey hanging in the balance. My own anticipation sharpened. The whispers on the dock, the frantic preparations, all pointed to something significant. A voyage of great importance, perhaps, or one more perilous than usual. This repair wasn't just about mending cloth. It was about holding together hope itself. Hours bled into each other, the rhythmic stitch, stitch, stitch of my needle, a counterpoint to the chaotic sounds of the port. My back ached, my hands were stiff, but the slow, deliberate process was oddly calming, a sanctuary within the storm of activity outside. With each completed stitch, a small victory against the immensity of the task, against the weight of the unknown journey ahead. A silent affirmation of my faith in my skills and hope for the sailor's safe return. As the sun finally broke through the morning haze, painting the sky in hues of orange and gold, I finally saw the end in sight. The air hung heavy, thick with the smell of salt and something else, anxiety. It wasn't the usual cheerful chaos of the port. This was different. A sharper edge to the sounds, a frantic energy that prickled my skin. The gulls cried louder, their calls almost shrill against the rhythmic clang of hammers, normally a comforting beat, now a relentless drum against my ears. I woke with a start, the rough linen sheets clinging to my skin like a second layer. This wasn't the usual sleepy awakening. Sunlight, pale and watery, filtered through the small window above my workbench, casting long shadows across the clutter of my tools, needles, awls, coils of waxed thread, and rolls of heavy canvas, my companions in countless voyages past. But this morning, the usual calm was absent. My heart beat a little faster, a premonition in the air. I pulled on my worn leather apron, the familiar weight grounding me. The sounds from the docks were escalating, shouts, calls of instructions, the hurried scrabbling of feet on cobblestones. Something big was happening. I could feel it in the very air I breathed, a tangible tension that pressed down on the port, heavy and expectant. Today wasn't about the usual patching of minor tears, the gentle mending of worn fabric. I saw it as I stepped out of my small room. A monstrous sail lay sprawled across the cobblestones, its vastness dwarfing even the largest ships in the harbor. It was a sight that stole my breath. Ripped, torn, and tattered, it bore the scars of a brutal storm, gashes that spoke of violent winds and raging seas. The canvas was heavy, almost impossibly thick, the kind used for the largest vessels, the ones that ventured far beyond the familiar horizon. This wasn't just a sail, it was a testament to a struggle, a survivor's tale woven into the very fabric itself. Looking closer, I noticed it wasn't just any sail. It was the mainmast sail of a flagship. Its insignia, though partially obscured by the damage, was still discernible. A huge vessel, surely. My usual calm was shattered. This wasn't a job, it was a challenge, a race against time. The urgency of the situation pressed down on me like the weight of the sail itself. Men bustled around it, their faces grim and determined. The captain, I could barely see him, but his presence emanated power, gave short, sharp instructions. Each word carried the weight of the sea itself. He glanced at me, a silent request, a trust bestowed without words. The weight of this task pressed down on me. This wasn't a simple repair. It was a lifeline. The lives of the crew of that mighty ship rested, at least in part, on the strength of my hands, the precision of my stitches, my ability to mend a gaping wound in a giant of canvas. The needle, usually a comforting weight in my hand, felt heavier today. Each stitch a weighty responsibility. The canvas was stiff with salt and dried blood. The air was heavy, a chilling premonition of the storm that had scarred the fabric. I began to work, the rhythmic stitch a counterpoint to the chaos around me. Every needle puncture was a silent prayer, every thread a lifeline. The sun climbed higher, casting a harsh light on the monumental task ahead, but I worked without pause, driven by a sense of urgency that had overwhelmed my usual quiet rhythm. The port was a symphony of worry. This would not be a mundane day. This would be a day where I held the fate of many in my calloused hands. The repair was vast, a monumental task demanding all of my skill and strength. The first hint was the light, not the gentle, gradual unveiling of dawn I was used to, but a sharp, almost aggressive intrusion of pale yellow across my small room. Usually, the sounds of the port woke me, the cries of gulls, the creak of rigging. But today, even those were different. They were louder, sharper, more insistent. A cacophony that seemed to press against the walls of my little house, a pressure building with the rising sun. I pulled on my trousers, the rough wool scratching against my skin, a familiar discomfort that did little to soothe my growing unease. Stepping outside, the usual salty tang of the air was overwhelmed by a strange metallic scent, a mix of sweat and fear that prickled my nostrils. The docks were a maelstrom of activity. Sailors, usually moving with the measured efficiency of practiced routines, were a blur of frantic motion. Their voices, normally a low murmur, rose in shouts and strained commands. There was a frantic energy that felt different from the usual pre-departure bustle. This was urgent. I saw the reason for the chaos soon enough. Lying on a cart, usually reserved for smaller repairs, was a sail. Not just any sail, but the mainmast sail of the flagship, the Sea Serpent. Its size alone was daunting, a canvas behemoth that usually required 3 men to handle. This one was ravaged. Gashes, jagged tears, ripped fabric hung like tattered flags. One corner was almost completely severed. It looked like it had been through a maelstrom. The color was dulled, the weave frayed, but somehow it still held the shape of a mighty sail, a defiant monument to its former glory. The air buzzed with whispered anxieties. I heard snippets of conversation. Storm, unbelievable, damage. Words thrown out like life rafts in a drowning sea. The captain, his face grim, stood near the sail, his hands clenched, a stark contrast to the usual calm authority he carried. Even he seemed to be struggling against the enormity of the situation. My heart quickened. The usual quiet anticipation I felt before a voyage was gone, replaced by a hard knot of responsibility. This wasn't a small mend, a quick stitch here or there. This was a battle against time itself. This sail held the hopes of a ship, of the entire fleet. The men and women aboard relied on me, on my skill, on my ability to repair this massive wound. The magnitude of the task settled over me like the heavy canvas itself. I was a sailmaker, not a miracle worker, but these men depended on a miracle. My fingers brushed against the coarse canvas, tracing the ragged edges, the rough fabric telling a silent story of a violent storm. The familiar comfort of my tools, the weight of the needle, the smooth feel of the leather thimble, was a small solace in the face of this immense challenge. The smell of tar and salt, usually comforting, felt oddly sharp today. Yet, even as fear threatened to overwhelm me, a strange determination took hold. My hands, trembling slightly, began their work. Each stitch now a prayer, a promise to mend not just the sail, but the anxieties etched into its fabric. It was the only way to mend something deeper. Not the usual pale, hesitant dawn creeping over the harbor, but a sharp, almost aggressive brightness, reflecting off the wet cobblestones and the slick masts of the ships. The air, usually filled with the gentle murmur of the waking port, vibrated with a different energy, a frantic hum, a buzzing urgency that prickled my skin. The gulls, usually a comforting chorus, were shrieking, their cries sharper, more insistent than I'd ever heard them. I pushed myself up from my narrow cot, the rough canvas of my mattress still clinging to my skin. My joints protested, stiff from the long hours hunched over my work, but the energy of the port pushed aside the ache. Stepping outside my small dwelling, the scene unfolded before me in a whirlwind of activity. It wasn't the usual pre-dawn shuffle of dockworkers and sailors. This was a frenzy. Men ran, shouting orders in clipped, urgent tones. Ropes snaked across the docks like restless pythons. The air was thick with the smell of brine, sweat, and wood smoke, a far stronger, more intense version of the familiar harbor scent. Carts bumped and rattled, laden with supplies, moving with a chaotic energy. Every face was etched with a mixture of purpose and apprehension. A storm was brewing, but not just in the sky. My heart quickened. This wasn't a routine departure. Something was different, something urgent. Then I saw it, or rather, I saw the absence of it. The flagship, the pride of our fleet, usually a magnificent sight dominating the harbor, was there, but its mainsail, it was ripped. A vast, jagged tear, like a gaping maw, marred the expanse of white canvas. It hung limp and dejected, a stark contrast to the taut sails of the other ships, already brimming with anticipation. The air grew colder as a sudden wave of dread washed over me. That sail, it was my responsibility. My work, or rather my lack of it, had left this mighty vessel vulnerable. The captain, a man of few words but immense weight, relied on my skill. The sailors, their lives entrusted to the sea and their ships, relied on the strength of my stitches. And now, this. I moved with a sudden sharp purpose, the stiffness in my limbs forgotten. My hands reached for my tools, the familiar weight offering a sense of comfort in this unfamiliar maelstrom. Needle, thread, heavy canvas, each item a reminder of the skill and the responsibility I carried. But this was no ordinary mending. This was a monumental task, a race against time, a battle against the looming shadow of disaster. The scale of the damage was staggering. The tear was enormous, extending across a vast section of the sail, threatening to unravel the entire thing. My usual calm was replaced by a feverish intensity, a fierce concentration that shut out the clamor of the port. Every stitch had to be precise, each movement calculated. The weight of expectation pressed down on me, heavy and inescapable. My heart pounded a rhythm against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the quiet precision of my hands. Sweat beaded on my forehead, mixing with the salt spray carried on the increasingly strong wind. Yet, with every thread I passed through the canvas, a quiet strength returned. I would mend this sail. I would make it whole again. I would ensure they returned. The sun edged higher, but the shadows of worry remained, lingering at the edges of my focused attention. This was more than just a sail. It was a life raft, a canvas holding the hopes and dreams of countless souls, and its fate, for now, lay in my hands. The sounds that usually woke me, the gulls' cries, the rhythmic clang of the blacksmith's hammer, were swallowed by a new, sharper cacophony. It was a different kind of bustle this morning, a frantic energy that vibrated through the very timbers of my small workshop. I pulled my worn woolen shirt over my head, the rough fabric scratching against my skin, a familiar sensation that did little to soothe the prickle of unease that had settled in my stomach. Stepping outside, the air hit me like a physical force, thick with the smells of salt, tar, and something else, the sharp tang of fear, perhaps. The usual pre-dawn quiet had been replaced by a roaring chorus of shouts, hurried footsteps, and the creak of ropes under immense strain. The port was alive, buzzing with a frenetic energy I hadn't witnessed in all my years as a sailmaker. I pushed my way through the throng of dockworkers, their faces etched with a mixture of anxiety and grim determination. The usual jovial banter was absent, replaced by terse commands and the urgent clatter of tools. Even the gulls seemed quieter, their usual raucous cries muted by the overwhelming intensity of the moment. My eyes were drawn to the flagship, her towering masts piercing the still dark sky. She was a magnificent beast, a vessel of immense power and grace, usually a symbol of pride and hope. But today, a dark stain marred her beauty, a gaping tear in her mainsail, a tear so vast, so devastating, it seemed to rip a hole in the very fabric of the morning. A chill ran down my spine. That sail, it was colossal, a canvas the size of a small house, its intricate stitching a testament to the skill and dedication of countless artisans, myself included. Now, a ragged tear, wider than a man was tall, slashed across its heart. It looked like the bite of some monstrous sea creature, a wound that threatened to unravel the entire ship. My heart pounded in my chest. This wasn't just a simple mend. This was a battle against the elements, against the forces that could swallow a ship whole. This was a race against time. My usual calm, the rhythmic flow of needle and thread that had always brought me peace, was gone, replaced by a sharp, urgent sense of responsibility. I reached for my tools, my hands trembling slightly. The familiar weight of the needle, the smooth, cool steel of the awl, felt strangely foreign in my grip. This wasn't a tear in some merchant vessel's sail. This was the heart of the fleet, the lifeline of hundreds, perhaps thousands of souls. This was a challenge that demanded every ounce of my skill, my strength, my very being. The first stitch was difficult, my hand far from its practiced steadiness. Each subsequent stitch required an immense focus. I worked with a frantic precision, ignoring the growing clamor around me, the shouts of men, the creaks and groans of the ship. The heavy canvas strained under my hands, the coarse threads a harsh reminder of the weight of responsibility I carried. Every stitch felt like a silent plea, a silent prayer for the safety of those who would rely on this mending. The pre-dawn light began to strengthen, casting harsh shadows across my work. The rising sun cast a fiery glow on the damaged sail, illuminating its vastness, its gaping wound, and the immense task before me. It was far from just a sail. It was a symbol of hope, of adventure, and of life itself. I had to fix it. The air hung heavy, thick with the smell of salt and something else, a sharper, almost metallic tang that pricked my nostrils. It wasn't the usual scent of the morning. This was different. A deeper, more urgent energy pulsed through the port. Even before I opened my eyes, I knew this wasn't just another day of mending sails. The sounds were louder, more frantic. The rhythmic thud of hammers was a frantic drumbeat. The cries of gulls were sharper, more insistent, woven into a chaotic tapestry of shouts and hurried footsteps. I pushed myself up from my cot, the rough canvas still clinging faintly to my skin, a reminder of yesterday's work. The light was already strong, painting the harbor in harsh, bright strokes. My usual calm was fractured. A prickle of anxiety, unfamiliar and intense, danced beneath my skin. This wasn't the gentle anticipation of a routine voyage. This felt significant. I pulled on my clothes, the familiar weight of the coarse linen, a small comfort in the face of this rising unease. As I stepped outside my small workshop, the scene hit me full force. The usual morning bustle had morphed into something akin to controlled chaos. Sailors ran, their faces grim and determined, carrying ropes and supplies with a frenzied urgency. The air buzzed with whispered conversations, punctuated by sharp commands and the creak of straining timbers. Something was different. Something was wrong. Then I saw it. The flagship. Majestic even in the harsh morning light, she dominated the harbor, a colossal vessel usually a picture of serene power. Today, however, her usually pristine mainsail was a grotesque parody of its former glory. A colossal tear, a jagged wound that ran almost the entire length of the canvas, marred its surface. It was as if a monstrous claw had ripped through the very heart of the sail, leaving behind a gaping, fearful void. My breath hitched. This wasn't a simple mend. This was a catastrophe. The sheer size of the damage was daunting. The weight of responsibility crashed down on me, heavy and suffocating. The captain's trust, the sailors' lives, the success of the entire voyage, it all rested, it seemed, on my ability to repair this impossible tear. The usual quiet rhythm of my work, the familiar comfort of needle and thread, seemed distant, a forgotten dream. This wasn't about stitching. This was about survival. I felt a cold knot of fear tighten in my stomach, but beneath it, a stubborn surge of determination. This sail would be mended. It had to be. The enormity of the task dwarfed me, but the faces of the sailors, etched with anxious hope, spurred me on. I began gathering my tools, my hands moving with a newfound precision, born from both fear and the unwavering resolve to face this daunting challenge. The sun beat down hot on my back as I surveyed the immense task ahead, a single thread against the vastness of the sea and the weight of 1,000 hopes. The smell of salt and that strange metallic tang filled my lungs as I breathed deep, steeling myself for a day like no other. The rhythmic tapping of my hammer against the wood felt surprisingly reassuring in the heart of this unfolding crisis. It was a familiar rhythm in an unfamiliarly chaotic day, a small island of stability in a sea of uncertainty. The air hung heavy, thick with the scent of salt and something else. Fear, perhaps? Or was it simply the heightened energy of the port, amplified tenfold this morning? The usual dawn chorus of gulls and creaking ropes was drowned out by a cacophony of shouts, hurried footsteps, and the frantic clang of metal against metal. It was a sound that burrowed into my bones, a relentless drumming that mirrored the frantic beat of my own heart. Sleep had been a restless thing, haunted by fleeting images of wind and waves, of straining canvas and desperate cries. I'd known, even in my dreams, that this day would be different. I pushed back the rough woolen blanket, the familiar chill of the morning air, a sharp contrast to the warmth of my bed. The light was already strong, painting the sky in streaks of fiery orange and bruised purple, a spectacle I barely registered. My gaze was drawn instead to the vast, looming shape of the flagship, its sails normally pristine, now a sight that made my stomach clench. The tear. It was colossal, a gaping maw in the heart of the mainsail, a wound that defied the skill of even the most experienced sailmaker. It snaked across the canvas like a monstrous serpent, its jagged edges threatening to unravel the whole fabric. From my window, I could see the captain pacing restlessly on the deck, his silhouette stark against the burgeoning dawn. He looked smaller than usual, almost fragile, burdened by the weight of the impending voyage and the knowledge of this catastrophic damage. My hands, usually steady and sure, trembled slightly as I reached for my tools. The familiar weight of the needle, the smooth coolness of the thimble offered little comfort. This wasn't a simple tear. This was a challenge that threatened to overwhelm me. This wasn't just a matter of mending a sail. It was a matter of ensuring the safe passage of the entire fleet, the lives of hundreds of men entrusted to the strength and integrity of this single piece of canvas. The heavy canvas itself felt different today. It was stiff with tension, almost resisting my touch. The usual rhythmic stitching, my meditation, my solace, was replaced by a desperate urgency. Each stitch was a race against time, a battle against the encroaching darkness that threatened to swallow the ship whole. The thread felt thicker, more resistant, each pull of the needle a conscious effort, every knot a prayer. My back ached, my shoulders burned, but the pain was a dull throb against the insistent hammer of my heart. The port bustled around me, a chaotic swirl of human activity. Sailors rushed past, their faces grim but determined, their movements precise and efficient. I caught fragments of conversations, whispers of uncertainty, hushed prayers, but I could only focus on the vast tear before me. It was a chasm, not just in the sail, but in my own sense of calm. Not just the usual cacophony of a busy port, the cries of gulls, the creak of ropes, the clang of metal on metal, but a sharper, more urgent rhythm to it all. A frantic energy thrummed through the air, a palpable sense of anticipation so thick I could almost taste it, a bitter tang like brine on a windswept day. I woke to it, a prickle of unease scratching at the edges of my sleep. Sunlight, weak and watery, seeped through the cracks in my shutters. The air hung heavy, thick with the smell of salt, and something else. Fear? No, not fear exactly. More like a shared tension, a collective holding of breath. I pulled on my worn leather apron, the familiar feel grounding me, a small comfort in the unsettling atmosphere. My workshop, usually a sanctuary of quiet routine, felt different today. The usual order, the neatly stacked rolls of canvas, the carefully arranged tools, they seemed to tremble with the port's frenetic energy. I moved towards my workbench, the familiar weight of my tools comforting, yet the unease remained. Then I saw it. The flagship's main sail. It lay sprawled across the cobblestones outside my workshop, a gigantic expanse of bleached canvas, normally a breathtaking sight of power and grace, now a pathetic thing, torn and ragged. A gaping hole, a monstrous tear that cleaved the sail almost in two, dominated its center. It was a wound, a gaping maw that threatened to swallow the entire ship whole. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't a simple mend. This was catastrophic. The captain's face, etched with grim determination, flashed before my eyes. The unspoken trust, the silent burden of responsibility, it all pressed down on me, heavier than any sail I had ever lifted. This wasn't just about my skill. This was about the lives of dozens, maybe hundreds of men and women, about the success of the entire voyage, about the hopes and dreams of a whole community. I felt the familiar rhythm of my heartbeat quicken, a drum against the frantic tempo of the port. The heavy canvas felt unfamiliar, alien under my fingers, cold and stiff, its texture speaking of an urgent need for repair. The needle, usually my trusty friend, felt strangely heavy, an instrument of both hope and immense pressure. I examined the tear more closely. The edges were jagged, frayed, almost impossibly long. The damage was extensive, more than just a few stitches could fix. It required skill, strength, and a speed I didn't know I possessed. The salty air, usually a source of comfort, now felt sharp and cold against my skin, mirroring the chill of fear that crept into my heart. Yet, beneath the fear, a familiar resolve hardened my spirit. This was what I was trained for, what I was born for. I wouldn't fail. I started, my fingers moving instinctively, guided by years of experience. Yet the scale of the task was immense. Each stitch was a battle against the vastness of the tear, a small act of defiance against the chaos of the port and the weight of responsibility on my shoulders. The rhythmic needle, my constant companion, was now a metronome, counting down the time until the ship's departure, the quiet rhythm a counterpoint to the mounting pressure. The sun, finally breaking through the clouds, cast long shadows across the massive sail, its light illuminating the colossal task ahead. But even in the face of the overwhelming challenge, a spark of hope flickered, a faint glow in the darkness. I would mend this sail, and I would not fail. Not the usual bracing tang of the sea, but a cloying, almost suffocating scent, mixed with the sweat of 100 anxious men. The port, usually a symphony of controlled chaos, was now a maelstrom. Shouts, the scrape of metal on wood, the frantic thud of running feet, all amplified, heightened, almost unbearable. Even the gulls seemed to circle with a sense of urgency, their cries sharper, more insistent. My own hands trembled slightly, a surprising betrayal of my usually steady nerves. The captain had found me just before dawn, his face grim, his words few. The flagship's main sail, ripped, needs mending and needs it now. He hadn't even bothered with a plea, just a statement of fact, heavy with the weight of responsibility. The sail itself, a mountain of canvas, lay sprawled across the cobblestones, a monstrous wound gaping across its heart. It wasn't just a tear, it was a chasm, a jagged rip that stretched for yards, threatening to unravel the entire fabric. The very thought sent a shiver down my spine. This wasn't just another sail. This was the heart of the fleet, the driving force behind a voyage that held the hopes and dreams of countless souls. My tools, usually comforting friends, felt unfamiliar in my hands. The familiar weight of the needle felt heavy, almost leaden. Each thread seemed to carry the weight of the ocean itself. I ran my fingers over the coarse, heavy canvas, feeling the rough texture beneath my fingertips, a texture that spoke of storms and salt spray, of sun-bleached canvas and the relentless pull of the wind. This sail had seen its share of voyages, each stitch a silent testament to past journeys. Now, its life hung in the balance. The men worked around me, a blur of motion and anxious whispers. Some tightened ropes on other vessels, others checked their own gear, preparing for a hasty departure. The air crackled with a mixture of hope and dread, a nervous energy that fueled them even as it threatened to overwhelm. I tried to focus, to block out the surrounding chaos, to find that familiar rhythm that had always calmed my nerves. But this time, it eluded me. The scale of the task was daunting. This wasn't a simple mend. This was a battle against the elements, a fight against time itself. Every stitch had to be perfect, each thread precisely placed to ensure the sail could withstand the fury of the ocean. The weight of responsibility pressed down on me, as heavy as the canvas itself. My thoughts drifted to the sailors who depended on my skill, their faces a blur of hopeful anticipation and underlying fear. The sun, barely peeking over the horizon, cast long shadows that danced and swayed with the men around me. I worked tirelessly, my movements becoming almost mechanical, a trance-like state induced by the urgency of the task. The rhythmic stitch, the steady push and pull of the needle, it was the only thing that kept the fear at bay, a fragile anchor in a storm-tossed sea. Sweat beaded on my brow, mixing with the salt spray that clung to my clothes. Hours blurred into one, the only marker the slowly rising sun, a silent witness to my desperate struggle. Slowly, painstakingly, I began to close the gap, each stitch a tiny victory against the immensity of the tear. The canvas under my hands responded to my careful work, the fabric regaining some semblance of its former strength. A wave of quiet relief washed over me, but only for a moment, before I returned to the task. There was still much work to be done. There was still a ship and lives that depended on the outcome. The sounds of the port, once a cacophony of fear, now began to sound more ordered. A sense of purpose replaced the early panic. The rhythmic thud of hammers seemed to echo my own needle, creating an unintended rhythm, a silent support in the growing light of the new day. It was, in its way, a prayer, a silent wish for a safe return. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. The bustling port, a cacophony of sounds just hours before, had settled into a quiet hum. The air, still thick with the scent of salt and tar, carried the gentler fragrance of evening flowers from the nearby shore. The familiar creak of the ship's timbers, a constant companion throughout the day, now sounded almost mournful, a lullaby to the setting sun. I sat on my usual stool, the familiar weight of the heavy canvas a comforting presence beneath my hands. The day had been long, even longer than most. The repair of the flagship's mainsail had been a monumental task, pushing me to the very limits of my skill and endurance. My muscles ached, my eyes were tired, but a deep satisfaction settled within me. The sail, once a gaping wound, now bore the testament of countless stitches, each a small victory against the forces of the sea. The ships, majestic and still, lay nestled in the harbor. They were the same vessels that had departed months ago, carrying with them the hopes and dreams of so many. Now they were home. I watched as the last sliver of sun disappeared, casting long shadows across the water. The returning sailors, some weathered and weary, others surprisingly unchanged, were already dispersing into the town, their stories echoing softly in the twilight. The rhythmic lap of the waves against the hull of a nearby ship created a soothing soundtrack to the quiet solitude. The distant cry of gulls, sharp and clear earlier in the day, now sounded muted and distant, almost ethereal. It was the sound of ending and beginning, of a cycle completed and a new one about to commence. A gentle breeze rustled through my hair, carrying with it the whispers of countless voyages past and the promise of many more to come. My work, often unseen, unheard, was nonetheless a vital thread in the tapestry of these grand adventures. Each stitch, each repair, a small contribution to the larger narrative of life and the sea. Tomorrow, the cycle would begin again. The rhythmic thud of hammers, the creak of ropes, the cries of gulls, all would herald a new dawn, a new set of sails to mend, a new group of dreams to carry across the vast ocean. But for tonight, there was only the quiet satisfaction of a job well done, the peaceful embrace of the twilight, and the tranquil rhythm of the waves. And in that peace I found a profound contentment, a silent acknowledgment of my place within the ever-turning wheel of departures and returns. The salt air, the canvas, the setting sun, they were my constants, my comfort, my home. And I, the quiet observer of grand events, would be ready.